In 1947, I took a trip to the Antarctic, which I subsequently described in a book called Invitation to the Ice Fields. One thing I did not mention in that book, however, is that I took with me a book entitled The Ego and the Unconscious by Carl Gustav Jung. In a very real sense, that book interfered with the purpose of my journey, for the more I read in it, the less I observed the precise outlines of the ice fields through which I was traveling. Only at the end of the voyage did I begin to realize, however dimly, that there was some relationship between that book and the distant lands which I had visited. That was the first time that I had seriously encountered Jung's work. I had studied Freud and Adler, but had only a superficial knowledge of Jung's book, Psychological Types. And then came this first real encounter. With his book in the pocket of my parka, I had slowly passed down along the length of Chile, enduring a constant rain as the ship passed by Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, beyond the range of Ultima Esperanza, across the Beagle Strait and Drake Sea to the great snowfields of the Antarctic. It was finally there, amongst gigantic icebergs reverberating with thunder as huge slabs of ice cracked off and fell into the sea, in an atmosphere of total whiteness, burning with cold, that I turned my attention to Jung's book. There, in almost total isolation from the rest of the world, I began to look for something which would close that other gap which separates the ego from the subconscious in modern man. It is hard for me now to look back on that time and place, and to discover what it was in Jung's book that so interested me. But I imagine that it was the idea of the archetype, which there in the Antarctic seemed so real, and perhaps, too, the passing reference to Jesus, and the suggestion that he had been caught in a world of brutal and autonomous forces, not unlike the barren ice fields. The book revealed to me a whole frightening world, as terrifying as the white silence of the Antarctic. It also seemed to strike a note in my own being, calling forth ideas that I had dimly conceived, but which I had not formulated. When I returned from the Antarctic, it was difficult for me to decide which had been more important for me, the trip or Jung's book. Nevertheless, at that time, I didn't read anything more by him. I was too caught up with the trip itself, going over it again internally in an attempt to understand its connection with my own being. At that same time, I also became increasingly anxious to travel to India in hopes of discovering there the roots of South American legends and myths. I was fascinated by the science of yoga, which I had already begun to study in Chile. In the course of my thinking during those years, I had begun to realize how difficult it was to translate the ancient wisdom of myths and legends into a rational language. I therefore turned again to Jung and reread The Ego and the Unconscious. From there, I went on to his commentaries on Chinese and Tibetan yoga. I read his commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower, his introduction to Richard Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching, or Book of Changes. I also read his observations on the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, edited by Evans Wentz, and his commentaries on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I read various of his alchemical works, such as his study of the Rosarium Philosophorum, which is attributed to Petrus Toletanos, and in addition studied his Psychology and Religion, Aeon, and his Symbols of Transformation. In much of this work, I noticed that the libido, which for Freud was synonymous with sex, for Jung was something akin to the Kundalini of Tantric yoga. The more I considered Jung's work, the more I became conscious of a parallel, say, between his analytical psychology and a path of initiation. It was as though there were a second language underlying the first, of which it is quite possible Jung was not even aware. Thus, the psychoanalyst came to be a guru or master, while the patient became a chela or disciple. If sickness is in reality a divided or incomplete condition, and health is totality, then Jung's treatment for the mentally ill was an attempt to bring forth illusory phantoms and shadows from the patient's past, in order to create a new sense of reality or of the self. And this process closely parallels the teachings of the Hindu guru. Nevertheless, what Jung was really anxious to do was to establish a dialogue between the individual and the universe without destroying the idea of personality or the ego. During the years in which I lived in India, I learned about some extraordinary beings called siddhas who had lived in the distant past. These people were alchemists and magicians and exercised enormous influence over India prior to the Aryan invasion. They had tried to maintain a dialogue between the ego and the self, but in place of the concept of samadhi propounded by the Vedantists, they attempted an even deeper state of trance called kaivalya. This word means isolated or separated, and implies independence from the universe and even from God. The siddhas tried to gain immortality within their own bodies and used the alchemical combination of metals to do so.